Last week, the House Interior Subcommittee on Energy held a hearing on how federal transportation policies affect local transportation systems. Next, on C-SPAN 2, we will bring you complete coverage of that hearing, which featured testimony from several U.S. congressmen, state and local transportation officials, and representatives of environmental organizations. Representative Peter Kostmeyer, Democrat of Pennsylvania, is the chairman of the Energy Subcommittee. Congressman John Rhodes of Arizona is the subcommittee's ranking Republican member.
The subcommittee will come to order. Today's hearing on the impact of federal transportation policy on the American landscape is the seventh in a series of hearings examining the events and forces that will influence what our national landscape will look like in the next century. What gives this hearing special significance, however, is that it comes as Congress has its first real opportunity to rethink national transportation policy since the interstate highway system was undertaken 35 years ago. Completion of that system comes as Congress is reauthorizing the nation's surface transportation programs. And just as the recently adopted Clean Air Act amendments have finally recognized in law the connection between what's in the air we breathe and how we travel. Today, the subcommittee will explore how Congress can turn our transportation policy into a vehicle for preserving and enhancing our natural and man-made heritage and rebuilding livable communities. In less than 2 generations, federal transportation policies, for better and worse, have reshaped the American landscape. While federal highways have shortened travel time for commercial transport and personal business and pleasure, benefiting agriculture, industry, and tourism, they have unleashed rampant, low-density development, which has depopulated our cities, overcrowded our suburbs, paved over scenery and history, and increased pollution. Too often we have laid out our highways first and considered their effects afterwards. Left to themselves, developers put new subdivisions where land is cheap, far from jobs, shopping, and people. Then the public must pay to build roads to serve this inefficient system. Spread out, low-density development not only depends on highways, it can only be served by them. It not only starts the spiral of roads and congestion, it makes alternatives in the future more difficult. In the Delaware Valley, where I live, for example, suburban and exurban areas have experienced rapid growth and development in recent years. The same can be said about metropolitan regions throughout the country. And because this sprawl is served almost exclusively by roads, more than 60,000 square miles of America have been paved over. These new roads have in turn spawned new traffic. During the 1980s, vehicle miles traveled soared at an astonishing 4 times the rate of population growth. In some urban areas, including the Delaware Valley, this growth has been twice the national pace. And over the next 30 years, the figure is expected to double. In our cities, close to half of the urban space goes to accommodate the automobile. In Los Angeles, the figure is almost 70%. The impact on metropolitan landscapes and natural resources has been devastating, as low-density sprawl spreads out across the countryside, often as much as 50 miles out from traditional urban centers. Commercial strips, office and industrial parks, and townhouse developments and subdivisions are consuming open space at an unparalleled rate, destroying vast areas of farmland, wetlands, forest, wildlife habitat, rivers, and lakefronts. We are robbing communities of their distinctiveness and America of its natural landscape. Although the contribution highways have made to sprawl is undisputed, it does not justify the simplistic notion that no new highway should be built anywhere and that mass transit can always solve the problem. Given existing spatial patterns, a mix of all forms of transportation is what's needed. Land use inefficiencies created over decades cannot be wiped out overnight. Rather, efforts must be made to cluster densities and improve linkage between places where people now live and work. Intelligently placed transportation, whether a well-planned subway, a feeder bus service, a strategically placed interchange, or a mix of transportation modes, can serve as a catalyst for channeling population growth to desired locations. But while achieving these goals requires strong ties between transportation projects and land use planning, current law pays scant attention to such matters. And because transportation projects are often considered in isolation from local development plans, subsequent attempts to ameliorate congestion and make communities more livable amount to trying to stop a massive hemorrhage with a Band-Aid. There is simply no substitute for linking proposed transportation projects to local land use and development plans. Failure to do so ultimately results in what is often referred to as the Los Angeles Syndrome, a deepening cycle of congestion and sprawl that is suffocating metropolitan areas in many parts of the country. Such scattered, unplanned development is evident in Los Angeles, Houston, Atlanta, countless other metropolitan areas throughout the country. Failure to plan for the future is rapidly eroding the quality of life. On the other hand, there are places like Portland, Oregon, whose comprehensive strategy to shape metropolitan growth demonstrates what can be accomplished when a community has a vision of how they want to grow. Their philosophy is simple. Long-range, comprehensive transportation and development planning is essential for creating livable communities. Land use planning must drive transportation policy, not the other way around. In Portland, this means that high-density, mixed-use development is concentrated along major transit corridors. The result has been a curb on urban sprawl, protection of open space, vibrant economic growth, clean air, and a quality of life that ranks among the nation's best. National policy must ensure, not discourage, a strengthened link between comprehensive community planning and transportation project decisions. National policy should require that each transportation project is considered in light of its contribution to community livability and that it fit within the environment it serves. National policy ought to be concerned with moving people and goods, not just automobiles, and with caring what happens along the way. This year provides an extraordinary opportunity to redirect our vision toward a more livable, mobile, breathable future. We must seize the moment, turning federal transportation policy into a vehicle for protecting the American landscape and in the process improving the quality of life for all Americans. I want to recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Allard, for an opening statement if he has one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any formal opening statement. Just state that from my perspective and from the state of Colorado that we do have a lot of coordinated efforts between highway planning and local zoning issues, and certainly wouldn't want to see action be taken where we take away from that locals to do the planning. I think those people who live in the area better understand the problems and their highway needs in that particular area. So I firmly believe that we need to keep a strong link with local government, but we certainly need to give them the flexibility to meet their own local needs. Transportation, I think, is important to the quality of life here in the United States. It's certainly important to the quality of life in the western part of the United States, where we have to travel considerable distances and where we have to rely on the transportation of goods and services for a considerable area, over a considerable area, taking a while to get from place to place, and the economic vitality of those communities equates to also a good standard of living and a desirable standard of living for many of those communities. I'm looking forward to the testimony. I'm not entirely clear in my mind why we have a transportation issue in front of the Interior. My understanding is that it's not anything that we will act on, but certainly we'd like to hear some of your concerns. I apologize in advance. We've got several meetings this afternoon, so I'm not going to be able to be here for all the hearing, but certainly look forward to as much of it as you can share with me while I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our first two witnesses are Congressman Bollard of New York and Congressman Sweat of New Hampshire. The subcommittee is delighted to see you. Please proceed in whatever fashion you would like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to offer several observations on the impact of transportation policy on the American landscape. One of the many benefits for America flowing from the intense struggle to approve the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 is the stark realization that major changes in national policies in areas like transportation are inevitable if the goals of the Clean Air Act are to be met. It is already the law of the land that transportation plans must conform to the emissions reduction targets of the states. As Richard Ayers of the Natural Resources Defense Council has said, From now on, transportation programs must, by federal law, be used as an instrument of achieving healthful air quality, not treated as if transportation planning has no relation to the quality of air we breathe. Just as national transportation policy in the past served to bind the nation together to the benefit of agriculture, commerce, and tourism, and just as it has led to easing of commuter congestion and the end of rural isolation, so also must modern transportation policy serve modern needs. National transportation policy can and must serve two interrelated needs: for clean air and for energy conservation. The reality of these needs grows more stark every day. Today, half of America's energy needs are met from foreign sources, and that proportion is expected to grow. It is a dependence to be feared and averted. 70% of U.S. oil consumption is related to transportation. Indeed, the Secretary of Transportation has said that oil has a stranglehold on America's transportation network. And we know that more efficient transportation policies can and will lead to substantial energy savings. 40 persons on a bus making a daily commute of 10 miles round trip instead of individually in the auto will save 4,250 gallons of gasoline a year. 9 good citizens driving in a van can reduce their fuel consumption by over 80%. Transportation options for American workers must be enthusiastically encouraged so that there are acceptable alternatives to the single-occupant vehicle going back and forth to work. We are in the process of reversing, finally, a decade-long slow strangulation of public transit assistance. This must be the single most important transportation policy decision we can make. We are going to reward comprehensive planning and make transportation decisions the product of such planning. We should develop the maximum amount of state and regional flexibility with respect to decision-making so that state and regional needs and solutions are the paramount consideration rather than federal formulas and federal categories of assistance. Policies that encourage commuters to use van and car pools, buses, trolleys, and trains, and discourage driving alone to and from work would help a great deal. Such actions cut global warming emissions, break up traffic gridlock, reduce road injuries and fatalities, and make the air more user-friendly. We ought also to be forging ahead on greater new car fuel efficiency and reduced tailpipe emissions. It would be a great mistake for Americans to be complacent about foreign sources of oil. We ought also to be more serious about promoting a national electric vehicle research, demonstration, and commercialization program. Mr. Chairman, autos and highways are as American as apple pie, and they will continue to play a central, pivotal role in U.S. transportation planning and reality. But new added realities require all of us to think clearly about transportation policy and how it will make certain matters better or worse for our citizenry. Traffic congestion militates against efficient economic development, and it damages productivity. Energy independence, or more realistically, a lessening of dependence on foreign sources of oil, is critical to America's future. But above all, the quality of air we breathe and the life-sustaining integrity of the Earth's atmosphere are both at stake in the formulation of transportation policy. Its impact on the American landscape is inescapable. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sweat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for inviting me to join you and the other members of this subcommittee in today's important discussion about transportation policy and its impact on the American landscape. I commend you for holding this hearing, as well as for your ongoing work in educating the Congress and the public about the need to protect our country's visual and aesthetic heritage. I hope my position, not as a congressman, but rather as the only licensed architect serving in the United States Congress, will lend weight and credibility to my remarks. It is also my pleasure and an honor to testify with my esteemed colleagues from the Congress, and in particular, Mr. Harvey Gantt, an architect whom I hope someday to see join me here on the Capitol. Transportation policy has direct consequences for the physical environment through which we travel and in which we live. In the past, this aspect of our efforts to move goods and people has often been ignored in the making of transportation policy. As a result, we have paid a high price in urban sprawl, ruined neighborhoods, and spoiled rural landscapes. Mr. Chairman, your hearing comes at an opportune time. The interstate highway system is moving toward completion. The Public Works and Transportation Committee of the House, on which I sit, is currently drafting legislation to reauthorize the nation's surface transportation program for what some have called the post-interstate era. This is a good time to take stock and see whether we can guide our national transportation policy in a more livable, land-friendly direction. I hope this hearing and today's outstanding witnesses will contribute to a full discussion of these issues in the House. It is no longer acceptable to talk of a highway bill as if concrete and automobiles were the only way to move goods and people. It is no longer acceptable to build highways without planning for their relationship to communities they cross and the landscapes they forever alter. My district in New Hampshire is predominantly rural. Its largest city, Nashua, is a community of 80,000 people. But New Hampshire is not immune to the problems created by poor transportation and community planning. The city of Nashua, for instance, is plagued by commuter tie-ups worthy of Boston. Its downtown is a non-attainment area for carbon monoxide, and much of the road network that stretches out from the city center to neighboring rural communities has succumbed to acute mallitis. Beyond Nashua, other communities in my district draw their economic lifeblood from many visitors who come to New Hampshire to boat on our lakes, ski on our slopes, hike in our mountains, and bask in our glorious foliage. In these communities, land use struggles are waged daily against cheap and ugly development, as well as encroaching and jarring roadside billboards. In New Hampshire and across our nation, these battles must too often be fought because poorly planned roads impacted communities in ultimately damaging ways. This is not a problem created solely by federal transportation policy, but it is a problem to which federal transportation policy has contributed. We have often been part of that problem. We must now be part of that solution. In short, transportation that is badly planned creates problems for communities of all sizes. The wrong highway in the wrong place creates the very problems it seeks to solve because of its impacts on land use and travel patterns. Strip development springs up, interchanges become overdeveloped, all to serve and to be served by the automobile. Small towns get swamped by traffic they never planned for. Areas once isolated from cities become havens for those fleeing those cities, bringing their cars and urban-style congestion with them. The people and agencies that plan and build our highways must be made to think holistically about the impact of their projects on the surrounding physical environment, whether that environment be an urban neighborhood, a suburban bedroom community, or rich farmland. In getting from here to there, we must not forget about what happens along the way. We must connect transportation policy with the communities it is meant to serve and most certainly shapes. Transportation policy must incorporate qualities of life concerns. It must attempt to preserve open space and scenic vistas. It must recognize and complement historic preservation concerns. It must work to preserve, not destroy, existing and vibrant neighborhoods. It must utilize, not gut, state and local land use plans. The Moynihan Bill, which passed the Senate last week, is a significant step forward in its approach to planning for our transportation future. In its planning provisions and its funding flexibility, the Moynihan Bill makes a positive break with the past. I believe this House should build on the strong foundation of the Moynihan Bill and craft a surface transportation policy for the 21st century. I have introduced H.R. 2279, the Transportation for Livable Communities Act, which you, Mr. Chairman, have co-sponsored, along with Congressman Boehlert. This bill addresses many of the planning issues we will raise in testimony here today. I hope that all or many of its planning provisions will be incorporated into the reauthorization bill, which will be reported out of the Public Works and Transportation Committee this summer. This year's reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Act affords us an opportunity to do something positive for the aesthetics of our physical environment. a chance to make transportation policy an ally rather than an enemy of the American landscape. It is an opportunity I welcome and one I hope we grasp firmly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sweat, let me ask you, because Mr. Allard brought it up, and I agree that local communities ought to have a great deal of say here. Isn't that what one proposal does in the Senate, is to provide more flexibility in ways in which the funds can be spent for mass transportation or for highways? It's my understanding that the administration's proposal is really not very flexible, but that the Moynihan proposal would actually provide more flexibility and would allow states to decide on their own how the money is to be spent.
Not only is that the case, Mr. Chairman, but I was just in the caucus meeting of the Public Works and Transportation Committee, and we this morning discussed that very aspect, that there needs to be provision for some kind of flexibility, an element of flexibility which gives local and state governments the option to employ funds in ways that they feel more fitting their particular locale. And that's something that the administration has not addressed, and that is something that my legislation and the legislation of which you've spoken is attempting to bring to the forefront at this point in time.
So if one favors giving local communities that kind of flexibility and not giving the federal government total control over local rights, then one would favor the Moynihan proposal, not the administration proposal.
That's exactly right, and I think this is one instance where the administration is actually demonstrating counter to the typical rhetoric that comes out of a Republican administration, that local authority ought to be given. And I think that this reshifting ought to occur through our coaxing and our encouragement. And I think that once this can be made clear, the administration, I think, will understand and employ the emphasis on local control once again.
Mr. Boulder, do you think people in your part of New York will take advantage of this flexibility to use these funds, not just for highway construction, but for mass transit? And as
about it, Mr. Chairman, let me point out that the plan to which you refer is authored by one of my constituents, Pat Moynihan, and I am working closely with him. So the system works as intended. Here's a constituent who had a good idea and wrote to his congressman, and now I'm helping him implement the plan. But I'm a big believer in planning, and I'm a former county executive. I know how critically important that activity is in terms of local government. Part of the problem is, and we all have to recognize it, is that many local communities don't have the wherewithal to have professional planning, and that's something we have to work, be very cognizant of. But of course, our local communities will take advantage of that flexibility, and they won't just pour more concrete.
It's my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the bill we've introduced would clarify existing law to, in fact, allow, I'm a little apprehensive about saying this, I hope it'll be a popular proposal, will actually allow highway funds, mass transit funds, to be used for acquiring scenic easements and actually for land acquisition.
You're exactly right.
Is that a good idea?
I think it's a very good idea. That's why I identify with the bill.
All right. Mr. Sweat?
Well, I think that in the whole process of making better use of our highway funds, we are trying to not only develop the most effective and efficient use of monies by getting people involved in the process, such as urban planners and the like, from the local community who have the best knowledge of how that community is growing, so that they can best determine whether or not a highway or a mass transportation network is the most appropriate application in that area, but that once that decision has been made, that there will be consideration of aesthetics that will continue to draw people to the use of that actual network that has been decided on. And those aesthetics will serve not only the life of that artery, but it will also enhance its utilization, and it will make people proud and happy to be users of that network. So I think that there are many benefits that can be derived from this employment of local planning experts and the emphasis on making sure that these are aesthetically pleasing as well as environmentally and mechanically efficient networks.
Let me ask you both and then recognize our colleague from Colorado. This is a tough question, but what do you think has gone wrong here? Why is it that that growth and development are so often synonymous with degrading the landscape? Why must, I've been on the Natchez Trace in Mississippi and the Skyline Drive in Virginia, attractive highways that you enjoy traveling on. Why is that so rarely the case? What has gone wrong, and what needs to be done to change it? And can this be changed with federal legislation? Is there any hope here to deal with this problem of, frankly, the American landscape getting uglier and uglier every time a highway is built?
Well, I think we act before we think. At least in the past we have, and there hasn't been sufficient emphasis on pre-planning, and I think you're seeing the trends change. I don't want to offend anybody, and I look up here and I see my colleagues, none of whom represent the state of Arizona, but if you visited Phoenix lately, you see that's an absolute nightmare. To get from one end of that city, that urban sprawl, to the other takes you about an hour. No planning, no professional approach to doing what we need to do.
Do you think, let me just ask you, do you think that the federal involvement, where there's federal money going for transportation, that the federal government has the right to withhold those funds from the City of Phoenix unless the City of Phoenix comes up with a comprehensive plan which deals with these problems?
Well, Mr. Kosmar, I haven't embraced your party yet, and I'm not even considering it, but I think we've got to be very careful here. I am very much in support, as my good colleague from Colorado is, of letting the people closest to the situation make the majority of decisions. But if we're going to put some of the bucks in the pot, and we are, and we're expected to, I think we've got to have some say too. So I think it can be a working, constructive partnership.
But in the final analysis, doesn't there have to be some kind of leverage that the federal government has?
In the final analysis, yes. I mean, I'm a strong proponent of the 55-mile speed limit. I mean, we had to be creative in our approach to that problem, and unfortunately, we've partially caved in.
I think that you're going to find that there are historical examples of both successful planning efforts and unsuccessful planning efforts. Certainly an unsuccessful one, which is currently being re-examined in the urban design community, is the whole idea of zoning in suburban areas, and how that had fragmentized the suburban population into pockets and has really driven wedges between neighborhoods in a community. This is something that we're beginning to realize needs to be corrected. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to aspire to incorporate planning in communities and the transportation methods within those communities in such a way that brings those communities back together. And I think that the example that my good colleague pointed out, and there are many other examples of where these communities have not been successfully planned, need to be improved upon. And I think that as we go into the 21st century, we are looking at not necessarily the inclusion of many hundreds or thousands of miles of new highways. We have the opportunity of incorporating systems that hopefully will make for more efficient use of our fuel, more efficient transportation of people and goods between different networks. And I think that we've got to steer away from problems such as the one that cropped up in Portland, Oregon, where they incorporated a mass transit system that ultimately had no growth, no neighborhood spring up around it, and therefore has no service to provide to a significant number of people, so that it operates ineffectively. We have to, I think, incorporate the proper planning by incorporating the proper professionals in the process. And the legislation that we're looking at here this afternoon calls for that through the use of incentives. It tries to provide those incentives in such a way that local professionals are brought in and utilized to their maximum ability. And I think all of this type of coordination is going to result in a more comprehensive and hopefully, therefore, more successful approach to development in these neighborhoods.
Just let me say one final thing, ask a quick question. To what extent do you think we've succeeded in doing this up to now in this country?
I would say that we probably have a history of 20% success, 80% chaotic rate of implementation.
Are you as pessimistic, Congressman?
Well, I would say that that's a pretty accurate description. We've only just begun.
Yeah, it's terribly difficult. I'll just turn to Congressman Aller, but I'll say that the subcommittee held a hearing up in your state, in New York, last year in Orange County. in the southern Hudson Valley. There's an area there called Sterling Forest, 18,000 acres. It's 45 minutes from Midtown Manhattan. It's the largest area of privately held land in the metropolitan area. It's a forest, 45 minutes from New York City. It's privately owned, and they're about to build 7,000 homes on that and really destroy that forest. There's no way to stop it. And I just wonder, you probably won't agree with this since you're a Republican and I'm a Democrat, but I do wonder whether the federal government should allow that to happen, whether there isn't a national responsibility to protect a forest 45 minutes from New York City, and whether the federal government should allow the destruction of the largest privately held tract of land that close to this nation's largest city. I think it's madness, but we feel so strongly about local rights and local land use control that it's going to be destroyed, although when you go up there, nobody seems to want it to happen. And I think it's one of the reasons people are so disappointed in government and are so concerned about our inability to deal with problems that really touch their lives very directly. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sweat, have you worked out a chart where we compare what is now being done with the Department of Transportation and what we have in your bill and what we have from the bill that's been reported out of the Senate, where we can kind of get a feel of the differences between those three proposals? Because I'd be interested in hearing some of those, not having served on Transportation Committee, to kind of get a feel of maybe some key areas, maybe the title areas in those bills where there's a difference in what's being done now, what's in your bill, and what's in the bill that came out of the Senate.
I have done a comparison with my bill and the administration's approach. I haven't had an opportunity of making comparisons beyond a cursory review of my bill and Mr. Moynihan's Senate bill. But essentially the differences that are found therein are predominantly in the emphasis of whether or not, well, one title that my bill incorporates, which the administration has not, is the historic highway system, which is not a title that is going to cost any money. It's merely trying to identify an historic route throughout the country, similar to the Freedom Trail in Boston or other scenic systems around different localities. But more importantly, my bill essentially is attempting to legislate incentives for the consideration of not only the most direct access between point A and point B, or city A and city B, but rather in establishing routes between two areas or two locations that more than just an engineer is employed and eminent domain is enforced, but rather that we bring in the urban planners, that we bring in those professionals who have a consideration of the societal growth and the changing fabric of that metropolitan area, so that we will be considering whether or not a highway going through that area is the most appropriate solution. There are other solutions that we need to be looking at, and we are currently looking for professionals who are going to have a broader, more societal approach to this. And I think that that is an element of the profession that hasn't been utilized in the past, and this is one thing that we're trying to encourage.
What is the cost of the piece of legislation that you have proposed as compared to the cost with the administration as compared to the cost from the Senate? Have you had an opportunity to look at those?
What we're looking at is an incentive structure that allows for additional funding on a particular project in return for the utilization of a particular expansion of professional capabilities in looking at the aesthetics and the design of a particular project. And so so what happens is that we are not affecting the overall expenditure, except that additional monies might go into a project because it is becoming a project that is more sensitive to the growth of an urban area, as opposed to just trying to find the most direct route between 2 points. What, in fact, this will have in a consequence to the overall funding is that there may be a slightly fewer number of projects that will be funded over the course of the funding of the Transportation Act, but those projects that are funded, which will still be a relatively high percentage, will be more effective, aesthetically better designed, and hopefully effectively better incorporating transportation modes that will, in the long run, save this country and its inhabitants considerable time and money in fuel costs and travel time getting from one point to another. So the short-term trade-off is that a slightly smaller number of projects might be funded because a certain amount of those funds will go into these additional and more comprehensive services. The long-term benefits are certainly focusing on the incorporation of mass transportation and aesthetic incorporation that hopefully will bring better utilization of the transportation systems.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, in responding back, in the part of the country, in the western part of the United States, but particularly Colorado, my district, if you drove from here to New York, you would drive through, that's how long my district is. And so we have roads, but we also have the surfaces of those roads are deteriorating. And the problem is having adequate dollars to maintain what we have. Now, I look at what you're proposing and trying to improve the landscape. We have a lot of landscape. And as far as we're concerned, probably the best thing that we could do to enhance the quality of life in those small rural communities is to have good quality roads. We also have some very severe changes in weather, from very cold winters to very warm summers, hot summers. And so when I see you talking about accomplishing all those things, it's going to cost some dollars to get those accomplished, and I just would like to know where those dollars are going to come from. Are they going to come from my maintenance and operation, or where are they going to come from?
Well, if I can respond very quickly, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Essentially, what this would hope to achieve is a better utilization in the urban areas on the East Coast in particular, between Dallas and Houston, or on the West Coast in the urban areas. Any place where there is urban use in the country, the object would be to more effectively address transportation problems in those areas so that on the long term they would require less maintenance, less reconfiguring, less reconstruction, which would ultimately free up additional monies to resurface the roads that are affected by the ongoing weather conditions and changes in climate that you speak of in your state of Colorado. So I see that ultimately you will be in a better position because of this type of legislation.
One more comment, if I might, Mr. Chairman. I really think that's a good idea. I'm all for reformulating the way we distribute the highway funds so we have more dollars available to take care of our highway needs, and I hope that as we go through the process that you'll support those formulas where we'll redirect dollars, particularly to those states like ours where we have a lot of surfacing needs. Thank you.
And I appreciate your consideration.
It's good to have you on the Bollert-Moynihan bill. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, I merely want to welcome the panel here, this panel as well as the others, commend you for your initiatives here. I think we're a long way from enacting legislation here. I think there are a lot of matters to be taken into consideration, but I do think that we certainly need to be giving some serious thought to the concepts outlined in this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Johns.
I don't have any questions for our colleagues.
Thank you. I just want to ask Mr. Bollert a final question, if I could. Why did the ballot, the bond issue, fail in New York State?
I think for the same reason the bond issue failed.
How badly did it fail?
In California.
How badly did it fail?
Oh, it 55-45.
And why did it fail?
Well, for the same reason it failed in California. I mean, the New York State is in serious trouble, financial trouble right now. We got a $9 to $10 billion deficit. And people were saying, where's the money? I voted for it, I championed it, but it wasn't good enough. And people are concerned at the local level. We've cut out general revenue sharing from Washington to the states, which I think was an absolutely foolish thing for us to do. We collect money in the fairest way possible through the progressive income tax, and what better way to distribute that to states and localities than through general revenue sharing? But we cut out general revenue sharing. We've cut a lot of aid programs to states and localities, and as a result of that, the deficit keeps building up and up and up. So you can come up with a great idea like a transportation bond issue or an environmental bond issue.
It wouldn't have added to the deficit, would it? It would have been a bond issue over a period of years, or would it have added?
Yeah, but people think in terms of government spending, and quite frankly, our credibility is severely strained all over this country. They don't quite believe what we tell them, and so our credibility is on the line.
Is it true that if local communities will not be able to acquire these lands, or that if they do acquire them, they'll have to do it with local dollars, which will drive up local tax rates, or will they simply not acquire them? Or they'll have to choose?
They probably will not acquire them.
And so they'll be
developed.
That's
the bottom line.
So they won't be protected. The Adirondacks, Sterling Forest.
Well, no, the Adirondacks is a different case, and the state has done a pretty good job. The Adirondack State Park.
Are you defending Governor Cuomo on his position on the Adirondacks?
Governor Cuomo and I see eye to eye on many things. We work cooperatively. We have a partnership in the best interest of the people of New York. There are a number of areas where I strongly disagree with the governor, and I don't take any blame for the magnificent deficit we have in the state of New York. That's his responsibility.
Well, very much appreciate the testimony, Mr. Boulder.
Now, one further thing, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
sir.
The Adirondack Park is the largest park in America, state or federal.
Well, that's right. We held a hearing up there, and this is an issue because local people own land. There's a lot of private inholders in the Adirondacks, and they want to do all kinds of things that a lot of folks think are inconsistent with preserving that area, and it's a very difficult, controversial area. But we appreciate your testimony, Mr. Sweat. We appreciate your testimony. Thank you very much. And call the next panel. This is the jurisdictional. It's a little imaginative, I confess, but because we do have jurisdictional land use, non-federal land use. Former Congressman Robert Duncan, on behalf of the Portland Metropolitan Area and Transit Now, accompanied by Robert Packard, FAIA, that's his firm, I guess, and Harvey Gantt, the former mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, on behalf of the American Institute of Architects and the American Planning Association, Commissioner Thomas Downs of New Jersey, the Commissioner of the Department of Transportation in the state of New Jersey, and Mr. Eric Hertfelder, Executive Director of the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers, period. Thank you very much. We do have some time constraints today. If you're able to contain yourselves and hold your all of your testimony will be made a part of the record. If you can hold your comments to 5 minutes, we'd appreciate it. Congressman Duncan, you're exempt from that, of course. You can speak as long as you like. And whoever would like to proceed first, please proceed in any order you'd like.
Good morning. Did you want to indicate that? On behalf of Portland, I would like Mr. Packard to precede me. He's got a dog and pony show he's going to put on for you if the chairman is agreeable.
Yes, sir.
We would yield, of course, to Mr. Gantt, Mr. Downs, Mr. Hertfelder, if that's agreeable to the chair, whatever you want to do.
Well, not only do you have 5 minutes to testify, but you got 5 minutes to decide who's going to testify first. So,
all right, let's let Mr. Packard go ahead, then.
Thank you, sir. Maybe you need to turn that so that Mr. Johnson and Mr. Darden.
I can see.
Can you? That's good. Mr. Johnson's going to move over to the Republican side. Just for a few minutes, though.
No. I think
that's right.
Mr. Chairman, it's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about Portland. I know that it's been held up as maybe a good example and a bad example, but I'll try to share good examples that we have been experiencing over the last 2 decades. We, as I think most cities in the United States, probably at one time or another, have always dealt with this issue of the ideal living environment versus what is perceived to be by many the conclusion of many of our cities, and have been trying to change the perspective of those, at least that live in Portland. It's a city, as many of you know, that exists in a state in which the environment is a very important part of our lives, whether it's at the ocean or staring down at our city. I want to sort of capsulize in my 5 minutes 3 decades of time and try to do it in a quick order. In the 70s, Portland was faced, like many cities, with development which seemed inconsistent with the image that many of us had for our city. We had large urban areas in which urban development had either created land which laid fallow, or urban renewal projects which removed a tremendous amount of housing, suffering many of the ills that many American cities were suffering. We were faced with proposed freeways which were deemed or planned to go through many of our best neighborhoods, and it was the rejection of one freeway, the Mount Hood Freeway, and the ability to use that money that came from the rejection of that freeway and the Interstate Transfer Fund that gave Portland the flexibility to do a great deal of which has happened over the last several decades. Part of the experience in Portland was in the 70s to develop a downtown plan concept that did not focus on specifics, but focused on the general components of what made good cities work. That being housing and retail and office and parks and schools. And it was during the 70s that in many cases where streets had laid fallow that they were turned into urban settings in which transit malls and a variety of other improvements were made. Along the waterfront in Portland, a freeway was removed, replaced with park and trees, became the home of a variety of civic activities, housing and hotel along the waterfront, and has emerged the rebirth of the waterfront in downtown Portland. It led to the renovation of over 150 historic buildings. It led to the recapture of the retail activity in the city, to where the retail activity in the city of Portland and that region's base is now in downtown Portland, not in the suburban regional shopping centers. It also focused on the fact that the streets and the right-of-ways that they represented were places in which people needed or should recapture and use as part of the secondary retail system. The weekend and nighttime activity in downtown Portland is as active as any major city in the United States now. In the 80s came what some people have called the public-private partnership. In Portland, we've referred to it as the dating game. It led to a variety of improvements, both public in terms of public squares, a variety of private improvements, the additional development of over 300,000 square feet of retail and office, shops, new department stores. Over 2,500 housing units have been developed in the core, along with new marinas on the waterfront. Probably, though, most important in the entire spectrum of what happened in the 80s was the development of the Banfield light rail system, 15.5-mile light rail system with 20 stations, which moves from the suburban community of Gresham into the downtown Portland core. It's one of many segments that are being planned in the city of Portland. It was not a transportation improvement as much as it was a vehicle to organize land use within that part of the region. It takes streets, much like the transit mall, and turns them into areas in which a variety of activities occur in addition to transportation. It has taken streets in the historic district and turned those into areas in which the public has recaptured that. There's been over $300 million invested in the historic districts alone as a result of light rail. It has led to the creation of a local improvement district, which is second only to the State Street Council in the city of Chicago. It generates over $2.5 million a year for projects such as cleanup and security at night. In the 90s, Portland faces many of the same challenges, even with its land use planning and transportation planning that most American cities have provided. It's dealing with the issues of suburban growth and how do you take new corporate development that is occurring in the suburbs and put it proximate to the transportation corridors that are being planned. We have noticed that the core of the city is not just the downtown core, but the central city is a much broader area than that, which has led to the redevelopment of the east side of the river, which has led to the improvements such as the Oregon Convention Center. This area of the city is now undergoing somewhere around $500 million worth of improvement. It too is immediately along the Banfield alignment. It has led to the lighting of all of the bridges in the city connecting the east and the west sides of the city. It's led to the renovation and redevelopment of over 80 acres on the inner east side, which used to be warehouses for museums and art institutes. What have we learned? We've learned that we had to go beyond conventional wisdom in using the federal programs that were available, and that we needed the flexibility that was available in the Interstate Transfer Fund. It was not sufficient to simply have land use and transportation and the quest for good design and the demand for good design from the public to be independent of each other, that they needed to communicate and they needed to coexist. It was important that each improvement, whether it be public or whether it be private, make a lasting contribution to the city, whether it be in the construction techniques that were used for the public works programs that came out of either the freeways or the light rail program, whether it was in the final architecture itself, whether it was in the implementation of an art program, whether it be in the buildings that were built, or whether it was in the public rights-of-way that existed in the city, or whether it was in the symbols of the city, be they grand or be they in the small details. It was important that for the city of Portland that the demand for good design, the demand for the integration of land use and transportation planning go on, and that the lessons that we learned in the 70s and 80s be applied not only to transportation and land use but to the region as a whole, so that what goes on in Portland, we hope over the next several decades, will be even better than that which we've been able to develop over the last several decades.
Thank you, very much. Congressman, are you going to testify individually, or Mr. Packard?
I will, but I have yielded already most of my time.
Well, that's quite all right. Please feel free. We're delighted you're here and honored you're here. And please.
I appreciate your having me here. You'll forgive me, Mr. Chairman, if I see shadows around that podium. I sat myself up here for a while, next to Biz Johnson, next to Mo Udall. I see Mr. Aspinall sitting in your place. To somebody as old as I, it brings back a lot of memories.
Well, we're delighted you're here.
I'm not sure that I need to add anything to the pictures and Mr. Packard's comments. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, 50 pictures should have saved 50,000 words, and I calculate that to be about 2 hours and 5 minutes that we have saved you already this afternoon. So if I impose on you for an extra 30 seconds, I won't feel guilty. Portland's experience has been a success. A downtown that was literally being strangled by the automobile, abandoned by business and by people flowing to the suburbs to escape the unhealthy air, the economic stagnation, and the physical deterioration has been saved, it's been rehabilitated, converted into an economically viable, socially exciting, residentially and commercially desirable showplace of urban vitality. How did Portland accomplish so much when other communities have tried and failed? Well, there are many reasons, some of which are subjective, so much so that we may not yet be aware of them. The nature of our people, the mystique of our land, the comparatively unsophisticated social and political system which produces leadership more dedicated to ideas that work than political philosophy or social status, who search for workable compromise but who can struggle mightily and remain friends, speedily putting victory or defeat behind us, to continue working together to solve the problems old and new. Mention must be made of the term as mayor of Neil Goldschmidt, later as Secretary of Transportation and Governor of Oregon, and the bright, energetic people with whom he surrounded himself, including, if you'll forgive me, my son Angus Duncan. But specific things were done, and enough of those things were done right to produce the result. I go back further than many of my colleagues because I think it started when the private transit systems in Portland collapsed. And that time the metropolitan area, including a bunch of Neanderthals, later replaced with these bright young people of Neil Goldschmidt, moved very quickly to take over that transit system as a governmental function. Most people now recognize transit as a legitimate public function to be supported by public money. Portland recovers about 35 to 40% of its operating costs of buses from the fare box, around 55 to 60% of its costs from light rail. It would fail today if it were private and required to pay taxes and produce a profit and a return on its capital investment. But it excels in self-financing compared to other public transit systems. And it is essential now, as it was then, to the economic and political stability of our area. It's not perfect, and it's still an easy political target, but it's good and it's getting better. The abandonment of Mount Hood Freeway has already been mentioned by Mr. Packard. It was a bruising battle. It left some scars in spite of our ability to forgive and forget. It left unmet transportation needs, particularly in our capacity to transport goods to and from Central Oregon. But improvement of certain roads and moves to construct some additional ones are recognizing those unmet needs. And eventually, I suppose, a Mount Hood Freeway will be built by whatever name it might be called. But its abandonment did two things. One, it furnished money for much of what we subsequently did. And two, it helped to elevate transit again to a significant, if not totally equal, part of our transportation option. Three, the downtown transit mall. Two important northwest streets were designated as a transit mall. Buses were given the preeminent user rights, and a conscious effort to create an aesthetically pleasing area was made. So pleasing that last week I observed at about 11 o'clock at night 3 homeless people spending the night in a TriMet kiosk, indicating again that solving our transit problems doesn't solve all of our social problems. Buses were given a priority, but autos were not excluded. And I think that's very important because Eugene, Oregon's mall, totally excluding automobiles, is a failure. We imposed limitations of parking in the downtown area. Air quality had deteriorated. I'll be through.
No, go right ahead, Congressman.
A lid on parking spaces were imposed, but here again, cars were not totally excluded. You could come downtown if you were willing to undergo the risks of not finding a place to park. But the risk of no parking, plus providing a reasonable, indeed an attractive alternative in mass transit, has resulted in improved air quality and a vastly increased downtown activity without a corresponding increase in automobile transportation. Transit has supplied the difference. Some 60 to 62% of the transit riders had an automobile alternative, evidence that transit is reducing auto use. Finally, we coordinated transportation and land use planning. Land use planning has contributed to increasing the urban densities necessary to furnish and support, market to and support the transit system. This has been an important link in Portland's success, and Portland urges that others seeking to emulate it follow suit. In so doing, Portland has sought to encourage patterns which support transit, as transit has supported a livable Portland. It has promoted business, residential, and recreational use. Downtown is as vibrant at night as it is during the day. One of the gentlemen, congressmen, suggested that we were furnishing transportation to areas of no population, and to a certain extent that's true. It's because the transportation district includes some rural, low-population areas, and we have felt that if they are to be required to be taxed for this program, they ought to have some service, and so we are doing that, but that's being corrected too, I think. We urge only 2 caveats here. One, that we recognize the social and economic consequences if we over-concentrate densities of population, and Portland has not done that. And 2, that we recognize that property or property values may be taken from individuals without compensation, only at the risk of generating opposition to all of the good which we have and want to accomplish. Rural revolts have resulted in Oregon in proposed amendments to our land use laws, which probably will pass. In these areas of remaining dispute, I personally, and not on behalf of my clients, urge conciliation rather than confrontation to achieve the ultimate success. In summary, we've established transit as a viable alternative and a supplement to the automobile, which is and will contribute and continue to be a major factor in transportation. We've integrated land use planning and transportation planning so that each support the other. We have improved the aesthetics and the air quality of downtown. We have revived a fading, deteriorating downtown into a vibrant, living, economically and socially contributing part of our city, which competes with suburban shopping centers on an equal basis. We've done this with a minimal impact on private property rights, and even these will, I am assured, be corrected in the time to come. And I thank you very much for your time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman, very much. Mayor Gant?
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I'm Harvey Gann, an architect and urban planner, and I'm appearing on behalf of the American Institute of Architects and the American Planning Association. We're all pleased that you've provided this opportunity to offer our comments on transportation's impact on the American landscape. From 1983 to 1987, I served 2 terms as mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, the state's largest city and one of the nation's fastest-growing communities. During my service, transportation was a top priority, and I found my training as an architect and a planner invaluable in dealing with this concern. As in most urban areas, suburban congestion became Charlotte's most important transportation issue in the 80s. Rapid suburban growth prompted longer commutes, but the cost of transportation improvement grew just as rapidly, and revenues from motor fuel taxes and the like remained flat. In 1989, we conducted a study of our transportation and land use needs and identified 30 projects essential to the future of our community. Most involved widening or building roads, but our list also included a reversible HOV lane and a light rail transit line connecting our uptown to a suburban center. Our program also included a greater commitment to bus transit and to improving our major intersections to make better use of existing roadway capacity. As we discovered early on, the way people get to their jobs, to the grocery store, to the movies, or to grandma's house is fundamental to any community's success. Transportation can determine how well a locality functions, how it treats its environment, and how it provides for its people. Since World War II, the Federal Highway Program has helped bind the nation together to the benefit of agriculture, commerce, and tourism. It has ended rural isolation and fueled world-class industries that provide employment to millions. Yet, by giving full throttle to the automobile, we have also created rampant overdevelopment, depopulating downtowns and overcrowding suburbs. Low-density development sprawls over the landscape, imposing on us enormous energy and power costs. There has been a social cost, too. Workers no longer live near their work, and shoppers no longer live near their shopping. We have headed down the highway to the suburbs to experience the freedom of life on the open road, only to sit stalled in traffic on our way to work. If I may quote the chairman of a Washington, D.C. area task force on growth and transportation, I quote, "We have seen the future, and it doesn't work," end of quote. This year, Congress can start this nation on the way to a better transportation future that more effectively solves local and state problems if it will seize the opportunity that the reauthorization process offers. I would like to suggest six principles to guide federal transportation policy to ensure the livability of our communities and the preservation of our open space and other natural resources. First, we must reach beyond the traditional thinking that our transportation system is only a collection of roads and highways. The system that will serve tomorrow's community must rely on the combination of transportation methods that best moves people and goods, not automobiles. Second, transportation policy and the funding that implements it must be flexible enough to allow states and localities to choose among a wide variety of transportation modes. Current practice drives the construction of new roads because it draws the most federal dollars. This may be good for the state budget, but it's terrible for transportation. Third, it is essential that this flexibility be used within a federal policy and planning framework. Planning should focus first on existing transportation facilities. Before new roads are built, we should examine other modes of transportation first to see if they move people and goods more efficiently. Transportation projects should follow plans for land use, historic preservation, housing, recreation, and open space, as well as the requirements of the Federal Clean Air Act and other energy concerns. Patterns for residential and commercial growth that make mass transit more feasible should be encouraged. The goal is to place transportation where the people are, not the other way around. Fourth, localities must be stronger partners with their states in addressing transportation needs and solutions. Localities must be stronger partners with their states in addressing transportation needs and solutions. That means cooperative planning and cooperative use of funds. Fifth, the planning process should incorporate adequate opportunities for the public to express their views and contribute to the development of the plans. A process that encourages public input can head off major stumbling blocks to transportation solutions. Sixth and last, federal transportation policy must assure adequate funding for those elements that truly make a transportation project an attractive feature of the community landscape, respecting historic properties, assuring adequate landscaping, incorporating scenic easements, and building in other enhancements. Too often, this nation has failed to appreciate how transportation projects must blend into their communities. The result is ugly, concrete slashes across the landscape that intrude in our communities and cut off people and neighborhoods from one another. Mr. Chairman, good planning equals conservation. Conservation of time, of money, of energy, and the environment. It's time to end the business as usual approach to transportation. It's time we put to rest the assumption that just laying enough pavement can solve the nation's transportation problems. I believe these principles will start us on the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor, very much. Commissioner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my pleasure to be here not only as Commissioner of the Department of Transportation, but as Chairman of the Board of New Jersey Transit. Just a brief picture of New Jersey. We have the densest populated state in the United States, about 1,000 residents per square mile over the entire state. We have more travel per square mile than any other state in the United States, and as a result, over 90% of the state does not meet clean air attainment standards and will be sanctioned under the provisions of the Clean Air Act. In addition, we're probably the most densely traveled goods movement portion of the United States. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey alone handles 15,000 commercial vehicles a day, moving imports and exports out of the region. When we think about national transportation policy, we think about the road, usually the interstate. We think about a national program that was started with defense in mind and intended to tie us all together. We don't think of rail, we don't think of transit, we don't think of harbors, we don't think of cities. Our image of that road never had them in it. The goal was just to build the thing and get it done. Federal priorities from the 1956 Act forward were never fully articulated, but they could probably be summarized as build that national road, build a rigidly uniform road, and in essence build a road that did not care or did not have time for cities, communities, towns, history, and corridors. For better or worse, it's built. It's done. It's no use going back and opening old wounds about the damage and the destruction that we did in building it. It's simply done. I would suggest that the major issue before the Congress and the national government is to do a better job next time about setting clear national priorities. It may seem like rhetoric, but if the federal government collects $18 or $20 billion a year worth of taxes, it is important that they set national priorities about how they're spent. And those priorities cannot be the old priorities that were focused simply on the modes and their limited parochial needs. Congress has already set one national priority. It said you will conform to the standards enacted in the Clean Air Act and all of the standards that go with that about energy efficiency, the reduction in vehicle miles of travel, the reduction of tailpipe emissions. I would suggest a second national goal we all have is personal mobility and the mobility of goods in our society to stay internationally competitive in a marketplace that is increasingly on our agenda. What to do? The national government has to set clear priorities about what it wants out of this $18 billion a year worth of expenditure. It's not enough to simply say build it. Let states and localities decide how to implement those specific national priorities. Don't prejudge funding of roads or rail or mass transit systems by funding very narrow categories. Don't create rigid categories of funding. Don't set rigid design criteria and funding eligibility criteria that force us all to focus on very limited objectives. Do eliminate barriers to setting up, to making some projects, do eliminate the barriers that make it harder for us to pick projects, like alternatives analysis and cost-benefit analysis on transit projects that are not required of highway projects, for instance. Do give the states and urban areas the ability to deal with issues of congestion and air quality in a way that suits local needs, not necessarily a rigid cookie cutter. Do give us the ability to fund projects that will make us competitive globally, i.e. letting us tie our airports, our roads, our rail, our transit, and our port linkages together, not simply funding narrow modes of transportation. Do let us solve problems created by transportation. For instance, do let us solve problems created by the mobile source emissions that put us in violation of the Clean Air Act. Do let us solve creatively things like noise pollution, which is the growing community concern, and they're not just interested anymore in noise barriers, but more creative ways of dealing with it. Do let us be a lot more creative about the role that transportation plays in preservation, and I am a dyed-in-the-wool preservationist because I see it work, and I see that it can be worked with transportation to make a better community. There are limitations in the current act, for instance, that will not allow you to preserve a historic bridge if the cost of that preservation is more than the cost of tearing it down. That is current law in the current Surface Transportation Act. That's silly. Do allow the programs to contribute more to the community. Do allow the transportation program to be a better partner, a better neighbor with communities, and not destructive in its relationships. Allow the creation of parks and community amenities. Our image of the National Road Program as an interstate is over, I hope. We need to create a new reality based on clean air, personal mobility, livable communities, and economic competitiveness. The message of national transportation policy has to be manage it. It's built for almost all intents and purposes. I would suggest that it is time to rethink the structure of the Department of Transportation as well as the structure of the categorical programs within the Act itself. Focus more planning money on the local area directly for MPOs, and let us get on with the business that you all want us to do, and that is to create a better America with these funds. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Hertfelder, with your permission, we're going to interject Congressman Pallone from New Jersey, who was unavoidably detained earlier when his colleagues testified, so that he could testify now, if you don't mind. The late Congressman Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't tell you why I've been delayed, but there's a mutual problem that we have happening in another part of the city, as you know, that has something to do with it.
I'm glad you were there. Please proceed. Nice to have you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Basically, what I wanted to outline today is legislation which I've introduced, H.R. 2335, the Transportation for Livable Communities Act, which I'm hoping can be incorporated in some fashion into the broader Surface Transportation Act or Highway Bill that is now being reauthorized both here on the House side as well as on the Senate side. And what we're trying to address really in this legislation is the impact of transportation policy on the American landscape, trying to mesh, if you will, not only transportation policy but also environmental and aesthetic concerns. Frankly, what we're really addressing in some respects is the fact that it's possible, it's very possible with federal transportation policy to build highways, to get involved in improving transportation, and at the same time take into consideration aesthetics, the notion that somehow highways and driving on highways can be pleasing, can be aesthetically pleasing. Unfortunately, in the past, in terms of federal policy as well as state policy, we've seen overdevelopment, if you will, in the vicinity of federal highways. And a lot of that, I think, can be traced essentially to poor transportation policy, or more specifically, a failure to link proposed transportation projects to local land use development and environmental concerns. Basically, the bill deals a lot with planning. At the same time, it also includes, and I think perhaps most important, a new eligible activity for federal funding called transportation enhancement activities, many of which are now only vaguely eligible under current law. And if I just could take a minute to describe what I mean by this new category of eligible activities, examples would include scenic and historic landscape enhancements, rehabilitation of historic transportation structures, preservation of abandoned rail corridors, including their conversion to pedestrian and bicycle trails, and also acquisition of scenic, historic, and recreational easements. And I wanted to give you a specific example in my district because we've kind of highlighted it when we introduced this bill, of a project called the Raritan. It's basically a project that's in the Raritan Bayshore area in the northern part of my district, which I think is perfectly poised for this type of increased federal assistance. Right now in Monmouth County, one of my counties, planners are considering plans for the revitalization of this whole area called the Bayshore. And very central to their plans are how to utilize an abandoned railroad right-of-way. Plans range from turning this railroad right-of-way into a bicycle and pedestrian path, or on the other hand, possibly converting it into a modern light rail. So on the one hand, we're talking about possible environmental recreation concerns. On the other hand, transportation concerns. In addition, the rail right-of-way would be linked to a ferry service, providing travelers an alternative route to New York City. It's essentially something that the Public Works Committee has been paying a lot of attention to, the intermodal concept, that somehow you can use rail and link it to ferry service and link cargo and passenger service, and at the same time put in some aesthetic provisions. In essence, this Bayshore right-of-way is an example of an existing asset that can be used to improve links with other types of transportation infrastructure and therefore reduce highway congestion and stimulate the regional economy, but at the same time preserve traditional and historic character of the area. I use that as an example and because I think that essentially what we're trying to do with the Transportation for Livable Community Act is to provide some flexibility to states and localities to choose their transportation solutions within the framework of planning and also coordinating transportation policy with aesthetics. And one of the things you probably know is that both on the Senate side and the House side, there's been a lot of emphasis this year in the reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Act on providing states with flexibility. And this would be another type of flexibility in terms of the use of federal funds, which I think is very important. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And let me, if you have a little time, let me just ask you about the applicability of the law, which we're co-sponsoring, the proposal we're co-sponsoring in New Jersey, because I don't suppose there's a state which faces these problems more severely than does New Jersey, the problems of growth. And while there are areas of New Jersey where growth is stagnant, certainly that's not the case in your district, which is a vibrant and growing area still. How would this law be helpful in your part of New Jersey? Can you provide some kind of example as to how it would work, how it would change the construction of federal highways and roads in your part of New Jersey to take into greater consideration local concerns? What would actually, what does it mean in an area like yours?
Well, I think if you could think of it in two parts. On the one hand, we're trying to incorporate planning decisions in the whole process of siting and spending money for federal transportation projects, whether that be highway projects or mass transit projects. The idea being that you would try to encourage states, if you will, in using federal funds for transportation projects to provide for better planning. If I could use an analogy, I haven't been in the state legislature now a few years, but I remember at the time when I was in the state legislature, there were a number of programs that were being proposed in New Jersey to try to encourage better planning. For example, when a highway comes in, to make sure that there are certain setback requirements, or that there are certain jug handles that are put into place, and a certain kind of density in terms of development near the highway. I mean, not to say that the federal government would set those kind of guidelines, but this would kind of encourage that type of planning. On the other hand, we're also trying to bring in the aesthetics aspect with the transportation enhancement notion. In other words, to say that you would get more federal money if you were to try to build in, if you were, say, using an old right-of-way for either and using it, for example, to create some kind of recreational opportunities. I used the bicycle pass, for example. Those are the types of things, essentially. I mean, if I give you an example, I think that there was a time, and I don't think there has been as much of it anymore, but there was a time when people thought of highways as a way of providing some sort of aesthetic experience. In New Jersey, the Garden State Parkway is a good example of that, which was built with the whole idea that it was going to be beautiful to ride along the parkway. But we've kind of we've kind of come away from that, I think, in recent years, and I want to kind of go back to it.
Is it enough to encourage proper planning, or should the federal government be doing more to actually mandate it, to require it, to, if I could say so, and you may not want to respond to this, to actually penalize states which don't have good comprehensive plans which deal with these issues? Should we withhold federal money?
I wouldn't have a problem with that. I think it's going to be harder to sell that, particularly in the context of the highway bill reauthorization. The tendency has been to make it a positive incentive in the sense that you get more money. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't have a problem approaching it from the opposite respect.
Thank you very much, Congressman. Gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Chairman, you want to direct question to any of the witnesses at the table at this point?
Well, I don't know how long Mr. Pallone has.
I'm going to ask to be released if I could.
Yeah, well, if you have any questions for Mr. Pallone, you might ask them now so that he can leave if he has to leave.
I guess I would ask you sort of a generic question that I'm going to ask the other witnesses too. It seems like there's a problem even in the Washington, D.C. area where we have a lot of people, even though we have a good high-quality mass transit system here, there's still a lot of people in cars and do a lot of driving. How do we move people out of their cars and using these alternate sources of transportation?
Well, one of the things that I've noticed, and I haven't paid a great deal of attention to it in the D.C. area, but I noticed the other day I was going out to Wolf Trap for some event, and I noticed that, what is it, 66, Interstate 66, that you can only use it during certain hours. You have to have 3 people in the car, I think is the rule. Otherwise, you can't use that route. I mean, those are the types of things that I think would encourage, I'm sure that encourages use of the metro system. So, I mean, you can, we've seen that in New Jersey also, where certain lanes of the highways were reserved for vehicles that had more than 1 or 2 or 3 passengers, depending how you want to do it, or lanes that are reserved for buses. If you make it more difficult, to use highways, particularly for one passenger vehicles, you encourage people to double up or triple up, or you encourage them to use mass transit.
What is your attitude about trucks that might have a function of hauling goods from one point to another point? You think it's practical then to put those the 3-passenger requirement, for example?
Well, again, in New Jersey, for example, and we do have, for example, on the Parkway, just doesn't allow trucks in certain parts of it. That's going to depend on whether there are alternatives available. I mean, in our state, when they put the Parkway through and they put those kinds of restrictions, there were alternative routes. If you have alternatives, then it's certainly feasible. But you don't want to prevent, transportation of cargo transportation, commercial transportation either, because that becomes a problem in terms of growth as well. I mean, I understand that people would want to do that, but they have to have alternatives.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I just interject that you can't do the same things in rural western states that you can do in eastern metropolitan areas.
That's true.
As you said, you need to establish HOV lanes. You need to lower, as I'm saying, you need to lower transit fares. You need to penalize vehicular traffic in which there are 3 or 4 people in the automobile. Speaking for myself and myself only, I think you have to hike the gas tax. For every penny we raise the gas tax, we earn $1.1 billion in revenue. These are the things you have to do. You have to provide incentives and disincentives to encourage people to do those things we want and not to do the things we don't want. And until we're willing to do that, we're going to continue to see people pouring into this city and every other city, 1 person per car, mile after mile after mile, because we encourage it, because we've got the cheapest gasoline in the world and the cheapest gasoline we've had in this country in 40 years. And unless the federal government takes a position to change these facts, we're going to continue to have the problem, which I think costs us more money in the long run. But we appreciate your testimony, and we hope you'll return to your duties. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Hertfelder, I apologize for the interruption. Please proceed, and then we'll go to questions for the whole panel.
And I'm very pleased to be able to appear before you today to summarize the testimony of Brenda Barrett, who is the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer for Pennsylvania. And I believe you have copies of the case study that she has described in her testimony. The story of the attempted construction and/or upgrading of routes 23 and 30 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania is long and complex and has not yet ended. There is perhaps no better example of the problems which occur when highway planning is reduced to satisfying demand and connecting point A with point B, rather than understanding that such planning is one piece of a complex system. The impetus for the new road building in the county has been rapid growth in the county, which has resulted in clogged roads and development, which has in turn collided with the county's traditional rural character and with the Amish and other plain-sect peoples who make the county their home. As might be expected, it is this character and the very presence of the plain-sect peoples which constitutes one of the major attractions and the causes of the new growth and development. To date, one road has been begun and then abandoned for lack of funds, however not before severing many farms in the county. Another road was widened, and currently advanced planning for a new alignment, advanced planning for a new alignment which was going to slice again through many farms was abruptly canceled by then Governor Casey in response to concerns which were raised about the continued viability of the Amish farming community in the face of such new development and new construction. Today, more comprehensive studies are underway, although the outcome is uncertain, which for the first time will take into account the effects of any new road construction on the preservation of the life and traditional values of the plain-sect peoples. If I may, I'd like to make 3 points to address the question as to how federal and state transportation programs and planning can do a better job of contributing to the maintaining quality of life. And these are lessons which I think can be derived from the plans in the case study for Lancaster County. First, planning in its proper place. Planning must be holistic and take into account all of the impacts generated by the particular action to allow the public and the decision makers to grasp the whole picture. Planning must include social as well as physical impacts. Just as important, transportation planning should be rooted in land use goals rather than vice versa. The impacts of road building on broader goals should drive the decision-making process and not the simpler goal of adding capacity to relieve congestion in a never-ending cycle. Second is flexibility. The impacts of transportation construction are complex. A corollary is that a wide range of modal and design solutions must be made available to address those impacts. Mass transit instead of automobiles must be a viable option. Being able to just say no to protect a special resource must be an option. Resources must be available to maintain and enhance existing facilities, and there should not be incentives favoring replacement and new alignments over existing. Finally, there must be flexible design standards to allow compatible improvements in historic and other sensitive areas. Third, and finally, like any other endeavor, transportation planning needs sound research and development. New approaches to roads and development need to be studied and brought into mainstream planning. An example of a leader in this area is the architect and planner Andres Duany, whose new communities, such as Seaside in Florida, have attracted international attention. Mr. Duany has taken a lesson from planning and design texts from early in this century and is a leading proponent of solving and preventing congestion through good design. Elements include a return to the traditional grid system instead of the worms and cul-de-sacs which characterize current suburban development, narrow streets, and careful attention to mixing residential and other uses, and placement of key community facilities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Congressman Duncan, I don't mind if you don't mind coming back up, I wanted to ask you a question, and Mr. Packard also. I wanted to ask you about the situation in Portland that both of you made reference to. I don't know, this may be too specific. The city of Portland has taken steps to discourage the use of automobiles downtown, but not to ban the use of automobiles downtown. Are you able to tell us how that, either of you, how that works?
Yes, they did it primarily, sir, by restricting the number of parking spaces that were available. Eugene, on the other hand, prohibited any automobiles in the downtown area. And I think there's a distinction. It may be a distinction to some people without a difference, but I think there's a real distinction there.
Now, does that mean, for example, that what if a fellow wanted to build one of these high-rise parking garages? Would he be prohibited or regulated? Or would that?
That's right. There was a limitation on the number of parking spaces.
So there's a total number of parking spaces permitted in the city, and if you want to build more than that, you can't do it.
That's right. But the same time, if you want to drive your automobile downtown and take the risk of not being able to find a parking space and all those frustrations, plus, I suggest, furnishing a viable and attractive and economic alternative in the form of mass transit, has reduced those automobile trips in downtown by a substantial percentage, while the number of employees downtown has increased very substantially. So I think I'm right. There's a small increase in the number of auto trips downtown, but almost negligible compared with the increase in what would have been a demand for automobiles otherwise because of an increase in downtown usage.
So it's worked pretty well.
Very well.
Is there any federal involvement here at all? Or
oh, you bet. You fellas, we spent a bloody lot of money out there, I want to tell you that.
Well, a whole lot less since you left here, but...
Beg pardon?
A whole lot less since you left here, but...
Well, I suppose. I suppose.
Part of the involvement also was from the EPA, because the Clean Air Act, the non-attainment violations that the city had expected to have with the parking policy that occurred prior to the parking lid being imposed. That policy, which the City of Portland developed, was done in conjunction with the State Department of Environmental Quality and EPA.
But essentially, the impetus for this has come from the bottom up, not from the top down. Right. Come from the City of Portland, not from the federal government. Is that?
It's come, yeah, not from the federal government. I'm not sure it emanated totally from the citizenry, but a lot of it was citizen involvement. As I suggested, there are a lot of subjective factors involved here, and with all the problems that Neil and I had from time to time, you got to give him a heck of a lot of credit during his term as mayor down there for generating a lot of the enthusiasm and a lot of the ideas that resulted in this, I think, very satisfactory result. And I say this without being grudging at all. I was one who thought they made a mistake in abandoning the Mount Hood Freeway. And that's why I suggested that ultimately I think such will be built. I don't think we can disregard the two faces of transportation. Mr. Gant mentioned it here. You not only have to transport people, but you got to transport goods. And you can't move goods on a streetcar line. Well, and we've gone ahead, we've improved some highways, and I think more will be done in the future.
Mayor Gant, you've dealt with these same issues as mayor of a rapidly growing city in North Carolina. How'd you deal with them there?
Well, I'm not always sure that I dealt with them totally successfully, because in an effort to win a third term, in part, I lost the election because of a desire to have a much more balanced transportation policy and to have the kind of flexibility.
People reacted against that?
Some people reacted against that because the political culture and the understanding of transportation is that the way to relieve congestion is to, in fact, add more miles of highway and more capacity. As opposed to a policy that would be a little bit more aggressive in the area of trying to affect improved transit facilities also. And the whole time frame of how fast you can build roads and get them in place, and many of the more complex issues that start to come into play, particularly in an area that was growing as fast as Charlotte. But my appreciation here is for the opportunity that I sense may be coming with the improvements suggested in the bills that are before you now, to first of all have this flexibility in planning and choosing at the local level, and to be able to choose from different modes to affect improved movements. Not a bias against
but do you think,
road building, but an understanding.
Given your
that
own
we need to balance
political experience running for a third term, do you think we can change this culture? Do you think we can deal? You know, people are very resistant to this.
You raised the question a while ago about how do you get people out of automobiles. I think the congressman did. How do you get them from automobiles into transit, which some of us who are planners and futurists see as a necessity. And I think the argument is well, the solution is complex. One, I think you may have to use some incentives and disincentives, as you suggested. But I also think
partly a political problem, isn't it?
Well, partially. But I also think that that as a part of that, if I had more flexibility with the transportation dollar to make the alternative much more attractive, and to work on educating the public on the consequences of what's going on, we've changed some things. In the time frame of an election for a third term, one is talking about 6 weeks to 3 months, and that education is not always possible in terms of the impact that a policy that gears itself too heavily towards simply road building will have on land use and every other aspect of urban life.
Thank you. Congressman? Yes, sir.
I just want to emphasize what he said about making the alternative attractive. The history of transportation and the succession of different modes in this country has been that one has succeeded another, not because of a government fiat or an order or a prohibition, but because a new mode has come along that was either more comfortable, faster, more attractive, less economic, less expensive, some advantage over what went before. In many respects, when we move to rail transit, we're moving back a generation to a system that prevailed in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But in Portland particularly, we have made that so attractive. And we've coupled it with a land use planning downtown that has brought residents back into that downtown area. We've got a performing arts center that has attracted people into the downtown community during the nighttime so it isn't abandoned at 5 o'clock. All of these things have meshed together. But I just feel personally, and I think our experience bears it out, that it's so important that you make this option attractive. We live in a free society. We don't live in one where we rely on coercion. And I don't think we ought to move in that direction. And I think we have made it more attractive, and I think...
Well, let me add to that, though. In the process of making anything more attractive, there are some disincentives that have to be put in place. Portland used, in fact, the limitation on parking, which was a choice and a value that the community thought was important, that made, in fact, the use of an automobile less attractive, but it required some political will on the part of the community to do that.
And
I have a situation where a young man works in my architectural office, which is in the center of the city, and he has made the choice just a few days ago that it was cheaper for him to ride the transit, the bus, to the location of our office than it was, in fact, to pay for the parking, etc. The transit cost is down because of the taxation that we put on the community and in terms of other funds that we hope that we'll have greater flexibility to use in the future, that made that alternative then much more attractive, let alone all the other kinds of benefits that would occur as a result of more and more people doing that.
I've taken more than my time. Gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Allard, I apologize.
Thank you. I'd like to direct my first question to Congressman Duncan. Do you happen to have the figures on how many people ride your transit system there in Portland? And
I don't have them at my fingertips. I'd be very happy to supply it for the record. Total number, that number, let me just say this. When we put in this rail line, we, as other communities did, made estimates of what our ridership would be. The day we opened, we exceeded our estimates by a prodigious amount, and it has continued to exceed all estimates of what the usage would be. There's been a corresponding increase in our bus utilization, too. I don't have those at my fingertips.
Well, as far as usage, it's encouraging to hear those kind of figures. What would you say was the thing that motivated people to use your mass transit where maybe other communities that had that tendency doesn't occur?
Well, I think the things that we've talked about that Mr. Gant mentioned, I think we made transit very attractive. The disincentives that he mentioned, I'd prefer not to have them, but I accept disincentives where health and of the population is concerned, and that's, of course, what the downtown...
But at the general yield, in the case of Portland, you're for the disincentives.
I beg your pardon?
Are there disincentives in the case of Portland?
Oh, I don't think there's any question.
I mean, reducing the number of parking spaces is a disincentive.
That's exactly right.
Now, but you're for that?
Yes, sir.
I am. You are.
I am too.
Thank you.
Let me tell you that this line which I try to draw, and I'm speaking personally here, sir, and not necessarily for my constituency, but this line that I try to draw between persuasion and coercion is an indistinct one, and it wiggles back and forth a little bit, somewhat like the time zones do, and we do that, I think, to accommodate overwhelming public interest in one side or the other. But basically, what we have to try to continue to achieve, I think, are those basic premises upon which a free society is based.
Be glad.
What you've got to do is you've got to be a little bit coercive, and you've got to do it right after you get elected. So it's a while before the next election, because if you do it that way, people will realize that it was the right thing, and they'll be very pleased. It's only initially that they're against these things, and a couple of years they'll look back, just as you have indicated a number of issues in Portland. You have looked back and saw
there's some of that, and I agree. As I say, it's kind of indistinct, but I would minimize that, sir.
So would I.
Because I just think that we get much farther down the line to what we all mutually want, a happy and congenial society with good health and job for everybody. We get there far quicker and more permanently with a policy of conciliation than we do with a policy of confrontation.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding.
You bet, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. On the facts that I was requesting, if we could have the budget and the number of riders per year so we could figure out the cost per rider on that, and is there a fee for riding the mass transit?
Yes.
Yeah. And
yes,
what
sir.
is that fee rate?
You mean how much do they charge per ride?
Yeah.
What is it?
Well, at least if we could have that for the record.
We get that too.
Yeah, if we could have that for the record, I think that would be helpful. Now, you know, the thing that I'm looking at is, suppose we're successful. Suppose that we get people out of their cars, and a majority of them are in urban areas, and we get them on mass transit. Mass transit construction, I understand, is very expensive, considerably more expensive than highway.
You're talking about rail.
That's rail.
Yeah, rail would be considerably more expensive than on mass transit if you go with that. Now,
I'm not sure of that. I'm not sure of that, but go ahead for the sake of
we rely on the gasoline tax to fund our transit needs. If we have less ridership, our revenues are going to go down, and we still have budgets over here that we have to meet. Where would you suggest that we go to get the dollars to pay for mass transit if nobody's using the car and not buying gasoline?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's been one of the most troublesome problems that Oregon has had. One of the gentlemen that sat here, the congressman, said that we were serving places that weren't heavily populated, and we did that because it was a part of the transit district, and we've got 5 different taxing sources, as I recall it, in Oregon, if not 4, some number. And the board of the TriMet had to select one. There was a sales tax, there was a payroll tax, a property tax, and all of these different things, none of which are satisfactory. They finally settled on a payroll tax. Isn't that what we still have? It's a payroll tax, and that payroll tax was applied coterminous with the transit district. And some of those little towns in that transit district weren't very heavily populated, Estacada, for instance. But they still were paying a payroll tax, so by golly, they were entitled to have a bus of some kind run out there. I think finally, instead of running one of the great big behemoths, we now run a little Mercedes-Benz or something out there, but they are getting some service. But that's what we relied on. Now, it isn't satisfactory, and a lot of people object to it still. And I'm not sure there is going to be, and that's a coercive tactic too, Mr. Chairman, But there's got to be, I think I mentioned that, that this beautiful system that we have would fail today if it were in private enterprise. Doesn't cover the capital costs, certainly doesn't provide a return on capital, it doesn't even recover all of its operating expenses. But we have become convinced in Oregon that transit is a public function, like police or water or any of these other things, and is entitled to be supported from the public purse. Now, you ask about whether or not it's proper to put some of the transportation dollar into mass transit. I have always supported that. I recognize the opposing arguments, but to the extent that you take some of these people out of their cars and put them in on a streetcar or a bus, you then free up capacity on that highway to enable those who must move goods by truck to have additional capacity within which to function. So I think it is a proper expenditure of user taxes, highway user taxes.
I have been to Portland, Oregon. It's got a beautiful city at the time I was there, and I haven't been there since apparently a lot of these improvements have gone on downtown, and I'd certainly look forward to that visit. You have tourists. You're an important tourist state. How do you get the message out of what you have downtown? Do you rely on signage, for example, on the highways to get that message instead of visit your town instead of Vancouver or whatever?
What a lovely country we are, you mean? Of how Oregon is as close to heaven as you can get and still stay on earth, you mean?
And how do you get that message out to a tourist that drives across your borders and heading? How do you keep them from going to Vancouver instead of Portland, Oregon?
I tell you, we had a governor there not long ago named Tom McCall, who felt the problem wasn't getting the message out. The problem was getting those people to come out and spend their money for 2 weeks and then to go on back home to New Jersey or wherever the hell they came from. So we didn't have to support it, see? So our message gets out just because we're there and because people do come. We may spend a little bit of money on television and stuff like that, but not very much. Not like some of these poor other benighted states have to get tourists to come in to see them.
You know, some communities use signage along the highways to advertise their community, let them know that it's a place to come and visit if you're a tourist. Do you use that at all in Portland?
Well, we have some signs at the ports of entry, yes, sir, that suggest that we're a beautiful state and we hope that they'll not throw matches out the window and destroy that beauty. Yes, sir, we do that.
So what is your feeling about, in light of that, what is your feeling about having signs along highways?
This is a, wish you hadn't asked me that question, I really do. I was in your position and I had to take a position. I was here when Mrs. Johnson got all this started. And I have taken the position. May I speak personally now and not on behalf of my people out there? I took the position that I just soon not have those darn signs on the highway. But that if we were going to get rid of them, we were really taking it for a public use. And if the public was going to do that, we probably ought to pay them for it. I was chairman of the appropriations.
But if the gentleman from Oregon will yield, you got to amortize it over a period of time. You can't pay him cash out, right? No boards would ever come down.
I accepted that amortization as a possible compromise, but I'm not sure it's a totally acceptable one. If you rent an automobile, for instance, you'll pay on it for 3 or 4 years, and you'll think maybe, well, the company ought to give it to me at that time. But that has a residual value even then.
Sure.
And you ought to pay at least for that residual value, I think. You see, I go beyond transit a little bit. I think that historically you look and you see a free political system accompanying a free economic system. And I've never known which created the other, but they always go together. And I think that one of the reasons we've succeeded where other societies and systems have failed is because we've recognized private property rights. And I know it's expensive. But if you want a man's property to build a school or you want it to build a highway, you pay him for it. And I think that's the same thing that should be true if you take his property for some other public purpose. Now there, I'm speaking for myself exclusively, sir.
I appreciate your frankness and thank you very much.
But I'm sure my constituents won't, sir.
Yeah, well, thank you. I have one question for Mr. Hartfelder.
Incidentally, when I was chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation, I put money in the budget for the acquisition of these highway signs. Perhaps not enough, but I did put money in there. I mean, I supported money being in there.
And I knew, just aside here, I knew Mr. Aspinall personally. And,
did you?
And glad to hear that you did serve with him. Mr. Hartfelder, I had one question. What is your perception as far as the Department of Transportation is concerned, as far as historic recognition of your highways and whatnot, and how do you see that, what do you see happening at the state level in departments of transportation from your experience?
Yeah. I think the Department of Transportation offers a good example, and by that I mean not only the Federal Department of Transportation, but also the state departments of transportation, which they work so closely with. The DOTs have, I think amongst all the federal agencies, one of the best records of really incorporating into their regulatory and their planning systems protection of historic sites, both identification and protection of historic sites. They have very strong environmental statutes, such as Section 4F of the Department of Transportation Act, to protect those sites. So from a state historic preservation officer's point of view, working with the DOT is good in the sense that they have a good infrastructure, they have good professionals who are well trained and know the laws and regulations. What is needed, though, are some of the things that I tried to describe in my remarks. When it comes down to actually designing the project and negotiating across the table, where you want to put a road through an historic village, or you want to, you have to upgrade the capacity of an historic bridge. In the past, there have been bars to reaching a mutually agreeable settlement, such as one gentleman mentioned the inability to use monies which would otherwise go to demolish a bridge to fix it up. So, and similarly, too high design standards in historic districts cause you to put in implements, whether bridge rails or other things, which are designed for crash testing at 60 miles an hour when it ought to be 30 miles an hour in a small village. So those kinds of things, once they're removed, which I think the flexibility in such bills as Mr. Sweat's, the Livable Communities Act, calls for, would really enable a much better conversation between historic preservationists and the DOT officials and allow them to reach better solutions.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of you for showing up here to testify. It's been interesting. And Congressman Duncan, I like to associate myself completely with your statements on individual property rights. I think it is the strength of our country, and whatever common public purposes that we may have, I think we really have to be very sensitive to the property rights of individuals. Thank you very much.
Well, I just want to say, let me weigh in very, very briefly, and then I want to ask Commissioner Downs a question with Congressman Duncan. You know, we're the only country in the world that allows this stuff to go on the highways. We're the only country in the world that allows this garbage to be put up on our highways. You go to anywhere else in the world, they won't let you do this. You drive in France, you drive in London, there's a green belt around the city of London. It's beautiful. It's protected. We're the only country in the world that has this attitude about, my God, it's my land and I can do whatever I want with it and the public be damned. And it's an outrageous attitude. We let people put these awful billboards anywhere they want. It's disgraceful. We're the only country in the world that lets them do it. I was out at Gettysburg, not far from my home, a couple days ago. Right on the edge of the battlefield, they're going to build a mall, 322,000 square feet. You go to Waterloo in Belgium or to Normandy in France, they'll lock you up if you suggest that. It's obscene what's going on in this country. It's disgraceful, and people hate it. So this attitude about, well, I believe in private property rights, we all believe in private property rights, and if you're going to take people's private property, you've got to compensate them to the fullest extent. But the idea of allowing people to do whatever they want with their land and the public be damned, I think is just something I disagree very sharply with. But I think a whole lot more people are on your side and Mr. Allard's side than are on my side.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think I said that you ought to be able to do anything under any circumstances.
Well, I exaggerated.
I suggest that this line between coercion had to wiggle back and forth a little bit.
Yeah.
And I don't understand the basis. I don't know. I've never looked at it under which the people in Europe have removed this. But
good sense, just good sense.
Well,
public interest.
All right. Look, let me say this, that we started this billboard removal, and as I say, I've been a supporter of it from time. We started this in the mid-'60s. It's now 30 years later, and the billboards are still there.
But let me tell you, Congressman, that in 1978, the Public Works Committee gutted all of the work that Lady Bird Johnson had done, took it out of the Public Works bill. We tried to stop it. We didn't even get 100 votes. And last week in the Senate, there was a vote on billboards, and it lost 74 to 26.
Okay, you know what that tells me, Mr. Chairman? That tells me that what we've been trying to do for the last 30 years hadn't worked, and that we got to back off a little bit and see if we can't find an alternative way of accomplishing what you and I think is an ultimately desirable
You're probably
result.
right about that.
You see?
Probably right about that.
That's my theory.
I'd like to go down and chop the billboards down at night.
Well, yeah, but you see, what we do in a free society is to try to reasonably accommodate each other's views, which are never going to be in agreement. I used to think when I first got in government that if I could just be a benevolent dictator and tell everybody else what to do, that'd be fine.
Well, it would be fine if I were the benevolent dictator.
No, not you. Me.
Just let me ask you very quickly, Commissioner Downs, are you able to speak about this comprehensive plan that the state adopted that's so controversial in New Jersey that deals with so many of these issues? I know this is not your specific area, but are you able to talk for just a minute about that, what happened in New Jersey?
We did 3 things in New Jersey. One is...
You're in New Jersey, and obviously. Where are you from in New Jersey?
I live in Pennington, New Jersey, just north of Trenton.
In Hunterdon County?
No, it's in Mercer County.
Mercer County, yeah. Go ahead.
It's where the Hessians that were supposed to be protecting the Trenton crossing were asleep.
well, thankfully we had the battle at Washington's Crossing, Pennsylvania, which took care of that. If it hadn't been for us...
Those Hessians hadn't slept, those billboards wouldn't have gotten
That's right.
The state decided that we had rampant land use growth in the last decade, and it was almost out of control. We had probably the classic case of suburban sprawl in the United States. The state decided that it was necessary to develop a state land use plan, and a series of negotiations with each county about cross-acceptance of the state plan and the county plan, what that meant in terms of specific kinds of land use planning. That land use plan would then be tied to transportation investments. In other words, we would not put roads where there was not supposed to be development. And the third was an access plan requirement that we are now implementing with some degree of controversy, is to limit access off of existing roads that is non-conforming to that state plan.
In other words, you're not going to build a beltway. For example, in Washington, they built a beltway around the city with all these exits, and that's just encouraged sprawl all over the area, ex-urban area outside of the city. Is that what you're trying to avoid?
And not only that, but if you've already got roads that are built, you're not going to let them be used for additional development if it is not in the county and state development plan. In other words, you cannot put a curb cut on an existing state highway if that curb cut does not conform to certain standards about the state plan.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of the members of the panel. Congressman Duncan, we're sorry you're not here, and Mayor Gant, we look forward to you coming here to Washington. Thank you very much, all of you. The final panel, Mr. Ed McMahon, former president of Scenic America, Ms. Sue Edwards, chairman of the Urban Environment Committee of the Sierra Club, Janet Hathaway, Esquire, is a senior attorney at NRDC, and Mr. E.M. Riss, Principal Rissy, how was it? Mr. Rissy, Principal, Synergy Planning, Inc. What, did you get anybody else? You can't pack, John. You can't. He doesn't. We have a terrible time problem for which I apologize. I have to be on an airplane very, very shortly, so maybe if you would each, your testimony will be made a part of the record. If you would speak very briefly, ask a couple of questions, and it's my fault, I apologize. We just let the other panels go too long. Please proceed. Mr. McMahon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. My name is Ed McMahon. I'm the visiting scholar at the Environmental Law Institute here in Washington and the former president of Scenic America. I'm here today to testify on the impact of our transportation system on the American landscape. When I was invited to testify, I thought immediately of a quote that started off an article in Time magazine about a year ago on the nation's growing slow growth movement. And it started off with a quote from an activist in Orange County, California, who said, quote, "We were in favor of progress until we saw what it looked like." I'd like to just show you a few slides that give you an idea of the impact of transportation on the American landscape. We could turn the lights down. This is how our roads started off, and if you ride across this country, what we have today is we're going from this to this to this. Our current transportation system, we need roads, obviously, and we can't get along without them. America's developed one of the world's most powerful and dynamic economies because of our partly because of our extensive transportation system. But thanks to the current transportation system, we're devouring land at an enormous rate while we're making America uglier every day. Today, over 60,000 square miles of land in the United States is devoted to transportation infrastructure, including streets, highways, parking lots, etc. Moreover, sprawl development is decreasing the densities not only of our center cities, but of our suburban areas as well, where densities have gone down by 20% between 1960 and 1980. The character of the landscape is also changing. Sprawling, look-alike, auto-dependent development is replacing farmland, forests, wetlands, wildlife habitat, historic sites, scenic areas, etc. It does not have to be this way. We have a choice, and I'd just like to briefly show you photographically what our choice is in terms of road building in this country. We can have city streets that look like this, or we can have city streets that look like this. We can drive in the country on roads that look like this, or along roads that look like this. We can have scenic vistas that look like this, or scenic vistas that look like that. We can preserve historic sites like Gettysburg, but then do this to the landscape that actually look like parks, or we can have parkways that look like this. Is this a better, more efficient, less costly, less environmentally destructive way to provide motorist information? Or is this a better way to do it? So what can we do? I'd like to recommend several things. First, we need to develop some corridor management plans that look at the view from the road as well as the lanes of concrete themselves. Second, we need to establish improved design standards to encourage a return to transportation policies of the past, where we laid out city streets as landscape boulevards and we built parkways instead of just highways. We need to establish a tree protection policy for our roads and a landscaping policy that encourages the development of landscape buffers along our roads and landscape mediums within them. For example, like this is US 278 in Beaufort County, South Carolina. We need to control the proliferation of billboards along our interstate and primary highways. We need to establish a uniform system of motorist information and directional signage that provides information. We need to expand the logo system like this to include historic sites and tourist attractions as well. And we need to provide money to acquire scenic easements along key resource areas along our highways. I would just like to conclude by saying that we have a great deal to be proud of in the United States, but I don't think we should be doing it like this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Ms. Edwards, I'm going to apologize in advance because I have to excuse myself, but Chief of Staff, Mr. Weiss, has some questions he needs to ask that we have to get on the record. So if you will summarize your testimony, and again, I apologize. Please proceed.
Okay, I'm Sue Edwards. I'm a volunteer with Sierra Club. I'm chairman of the Urban Environment Committee and also a professional planner in my home life. On behalf of nearly 628,000 Sierra Club members, we thank you for the opportunity to make this testimony. The transportation issue spans many of the traditional Sierra Club interests that most people aren't necessarily aware of, that of global warming, of protection of wilderness and our offshore areas from oil drilling, energy conservation and efficiency, preservation of endangered species habitat, the environmental costs of air and water pollution, and the conservation of wetlands, agricultural areas, forest, parks, and green belts. The Sierra Club operates under a motto, which is taken from our founder, John Muir, that observes that when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. I think that's what we're looking at here with the transportation policy, that it touches many of the very important environmental issues in our country and many of the societal issues as well. The land use implications of transportation policy have been documented to show that in cities such as Los Angeles, nearly 2/3 of the land area is supporting the auto-dependent uses, and in other cities, between 30 and 60% of the land uses are in automobile-serving uses. Let's see. The result of this dedication to automobile-serving uses has been a decreasing density, increasing vehicle miles traveled, and longer trip lengths, including more congestion, longer waits in traffic, and increasing air pollution. Not only are inefficient land uses promoted by excessive auto usage, but substantial motor vehicle usage subsidies are provided by state and local governments. And this distorts our transportation priorities and drives excessive additional auto use. These generally unrecognized subsidies include road construction and maintenance cost, the costs of engineering, planning, and design of road projects, police, fire, and emergency protection provided by local and state governments, lost property tax revenues when land and other improvements are removed from the productive tax rolls, the costs to health, crop, and materials in the damage to air and water pollution, and also the policing and supply regulation of our petroleum resources. Sierra Club is, of course, interested in the planning aspects of transportation policies, and particularly in improved public opportunities at the earliest stages of planning to encourage consideration of conservation and preservation actions. Any proposed transportation projects should be consistent with the existing community planning and land use plans, including air quality and environmental plans, and it should demonstrate that there has been a full consideration of multiple modes of transportation, not just highway usage, and thus reducing the demand for single passenger automobile traffic. Sierra Club members are going to continue to be involved in the reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Act, and we are offering our assistance in any way to help adequately protect our environmental resources.
Thank you, Ms. Hathaway.
Thank you. I'm Janet Hathaway, a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council, a national nonprofit environmental group. I think it's an obvious fact that transportation does impact the American landscape, but I think it's important to have this hearing because the impact is not often thought about in advance and planned for. Every American, whether a resident of my hometown of Silver Plume, Colorado, or a resident of a major metropolis, is profoundly affected by both the physical shaping and by the opportunities that are opened or precluded by transportation available to that individual. The consequences of transportation, both the modes available and the design, are fundamental in terms of energy conservation, environmental quality, park preservation, land values, work and recreational opportunities, civic involvement, and cohesive neighborhoods. Robert Frost observed that good fences make good neighbors, but highway structures that bisect communities often have quite an opposite effect. There is evidence that mixed-use, high-density urban areas have lower per capita energy consumption, automobile usage, vehicular air emissions, and typical lower-density suburbs. A recent study found that automobile cities with an average of 8 persons per acre have a per capita gasoline consumption of 870 kilograms. Denser public transit cities have an average of 36 people per acre who, on a per capita basis, consume 220 kilograms of gasoline, or only 1/4 as much. Residents of Manhattan, one of the most concentrated development cities, drive only 1/7 as much as the average American. New Yorkers generally drive 1/4 as much, and San Franciscans drive only 1/3 as much as the average American. There are also apparently some significant energy efficiencies in dense development. Despite the hot summers and cold winters of New York, the per capita energy consumption of New Yorkers is only 1/2 as much as the average American's consumption. It's both surprising and disappointing that for the most part Americans have made transportation decisions in isolation from other important federal policies concerning labor, leisure, health, and environmental protection. To continue to do so would be folly. We can no longer blindly assume that more or larger highways will best serve all of our transportation needs. Mass transit systems including rail, bus, trolley, and van pools are generally more energy efficient and less polluting than highway construction or expansion. A subway can carry 35 times as many people as a lane of single-occupant automobiles. A surface rapid rail, about 25 times as many, and a lane of buses will contain 15 times as many as occupants in a single occupancy vehicle lane. According to the American Public Transit Association, single occupancy driving contributes 200 times the amount of hydrocarbons, 700 times the amount of carbon monoxide, and 4 times the amount of nitrous oxides in grams per passenger mile as compared to rail. Rail systems are also more compatible with moderate to high density mixed usage urban or suburban settings. With our pressing need to improve efficiency and economic efficiency and our environmental quality, we cannot afford to squander resources or build costly transportation systems based on short-term gain. The time is long overdue for systematic local, state, and regional planning, including a careful examination of alternatives and likely impacts on land use, development, energy use, pollution, and historic and environmental resources. The commendable transportation bill adopted last week by the Senate, which greatly enhances intermodal flexibility and mandates greatly expanded state and regional planning, may herald the beginning of a post-highway era of transportation policy. While streets and highways continue to have an essential role, transportation is not merely a network of roads. The time has come for an integrated approach to moving people and freight, and NRDC in particular commends the introduction of H.R. 2279 and 2335, the Livable Communities Acts, and urges that they be incorporated into the transportation bill that is ultimately passed by the House of Representatives. And we hope to work with you in achieving that goal. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final panelists, Ed, Mr. Rissy.
Thank you very much. I'm Ed Rissy, a principal of Synergy Planning, a professional planner and a resident of the Washington-Baltimore region representing the Urban Design Division of the American Planning Association. We appreciate the opportunity to address an important aspect of national policy, the relationship between transportation policy and the American landscape. The current crisis in this issue is not that experts do not understand the relationship. The crisis is that Congress and the American governance structure in general continues with business as usual, as if these relationships did not exist. We all know that urban regions have expanded substantially in the last 40 years. Few have a grasp of the extent or impact of this expansion. Data and information are not easily obtained, and the land areas of urban regions are so extensive that the urban region is hard to visualize. That is especially true when we ride through an urban region and see a rural landscape that looks rural and pastoral. The land is really urban, urban by value, urban by activities of its residents, and urban by the cumulative impact of land, air, and water resources. I'd like to address the relationship between urban pattern and a prosperous economy, a sustainable environment, and amenable neighborhoods, communities, and regions necessary for a stable society. The patterns of urban use dictate the cost of service, the access to open space, and the impact of man's activity on the environment. This has been documented by most of the speakers before you this afternoon. I only suggest that many are fooled by appearances. The problem is far more extensive than it appears. I'd like to specifically address the relationship between urban pattern and economic competitiveness. The automobile and the truck using the federal interstate highway system have taken the Industrial Revolution to its logical conclusion. The modern transportation system has made concentrations of jobs and trading opportunities viable in dispersed locations and has scattered the urban residents across once rural countryside. This newly scattered, sprawled regional pattern has resulted in tremendous demand on public service system. The transportation system cannot sustain or support the pattern of regional land use it has generated. This pattern of transportation congestion has spawned, has significant impact on air and water quality and on the economic viability of our land use patterns. We've reached the point where it's clear that sustainable economic activity in a healthy environment cannot be maintained in the dispersed form that our transportation system has spawned. We need only read the Chesapeake Bay 2020 report and any of the thousands of other documents on this topic to confirm this view. The current physical pattern will not support a prosperous economy, the economy that will be needed to support the physical and social structure necessary for a stable society and for advancement of civilization. Within the regions of the United States, we have significant differences, and we can therefore analyze the impact of one regional pattern versus another. The most effective way to see the impact is to examine the bottom line, the cost of doing business in different regions. For instance, in the Washington region, you'll find that for professional technical service X, one of our high-tech industries must pay $27 an hour. That same skill, the same education and experience level is available in the Minneapolis region for $18 an hour. Similar comparisons are available for school teachers and for every other public and private service. Why do we have to pay nearly twice as much in a congested urban region as in a relatively well-configured urban region? Because that's what the person who possesses those skills must receive in order to have an acceptable standard of living in a poorly configured urban region. That is what the market demands, given the high cost of housing, which is dependent upon pattern, the length of the time that they must commute from affordable housing, which is dependent upon pattern, the local tax burden, which is dependent upon pattern. In fact, the cost of goods and services that residents and employees use, all of these are dependent upon the pattern and density of land use. While these differences may be interesting or even critical concern to one region or another, they should be of grave national concern. The same problem with competitiveness exists between our U.S. regions when compared with 150 or so urban regions in the European Economic Community or the modern regions of the Pacific Rim. These urban regions, with whom we must compete in the 21st century, have patterns and density of land use which will allow an enterprise in Singapore, Barcelona, or Göteborg to provide goods and services far less expensively than the same service can be provided by an enterprise in our sprawling urban regions. In conclusion, there is a direct linkage between federal transportation policy and the pattern of our urban regions. We must have new patterns and densities if we are to have a competitive economy, a sustainable environment, or amenable communities. To have new patterns and densities, we must have fundamental changes in the way we plan and guide growth. We must plan and guide growth regionally, and that requires new systems of governance. There's an urgent and critical need for comprehensive planning and rational urban design of our urban regions. There's also a critical need to integrate transportation policy and land use policy to create functional and amenable patterns and densities. One place to deal with this need is in the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act, now before Congress. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rissy. Mr. McMahon, do you believe that if transportation choices are available for much of the American public, that they will choose to travel by other means than car, as we see in Europe?
I think clearly if the choices were there, many people would choose other alternatives to travel by foot, by bicycle, by mass transit, for example. I mean, I live in Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is serviced by the metro system, and virtually everyone who lives within walking distance of the metro will take the metro and won't drive into Washington, D.C. And I think that I could easily drive my car. I have a place I could park at my office. But when the choice is provided, I think that what you'd have is a very different kind of pattern than you'd have today.
How much of the damage we've inflicted on ourselves by bad highway design do you believe could be turned to an advantage by improving the visual character of the transportation corridors?
The way we see America is by and large out the windows of an automobile. We see relatively little of any place on foot. In America, the beautiful for most people today is what we see from our streets and our highways. I believe we need to do a better job of protecting the view from the road, because that indeed is protecting the view of America. And I think that there are many, many examples all across the country of where road planning does not need to destroy the distinctive character of a place. Road development does not. Just think about the Natchez Trace, for example, or the Blue Ridge Parkway, which are roads that respect the character of the landscape. Think about the Merritt Parkway in New York as another example. These are roads that get people from point A to point B, but they also make the journey as rewarding as the destination.
Thank you, Mr. Rissy. Ms. Edwards, your testimony certainly takes the very broad view of what impacts transportation policy has on virtually every aspect of our lives, as John Muir so aptly pointed out to us. What do you think about the unabated demand of the public for mobility, and how do you think transportation policy should deal with that issue?
I think, as many of the other speakers have indicated, that it calls for a restructuring of our approach to land use planning. I feel that given proper planning, that the densities that densities can be increased to the point where they will sustain various other forms of transportation, and I believe that people will be, when given the choice, will select other modes of transportation given the costs of using the single occupant automobile.
Will you expand on why NEPA falls short in assuring that we choose the best alternative available to solve transportation problems? And I'm speaking here on a project-by-project basis. You spoke about that a little.
Well, in an experience that I had, I could see how the NEPA process, the National Environmental Policy Act, was as I see, undermined by severing a piece of the transportation project from the whole, and it happened that the piece that was severed was the most controversial, and that was later evaluated under the less stringent state requirements. I feel that that kind of the capacity to make those distinctions on various segments undermines what the National Environmental Policy Act was intended to do, and it leads to a improper evaluation of the full alternatives.
Thank you. Ms. Hathaway, you've strongly endorsed the Transportation for Livable Communities Act. If the provisions it contains are not addressed as part of the reauthorization package, what do you see ahead for the environment? In other words, can you tell us what part does this play in seriously addressing our environmental concerns in light of other enacted environmental statutes?
Well, I have a very distinct fear that if there is not an incorporation of either these exact provisions or something very much along those lines, that the goal of integrating transportation and air quality, for example, and also preservation of our other natural resources such as wetlands, simply will not occur. It doesn't happen by accident that you achieve an air quality goal, and in particular the mobile source contribution to air pollution is the biggest contribution in most urban areas. If there is not a systematic local level involvement in the planning decisions, and if there is not a significant contribution to planning in terms of dollar amounts that come from the Surface Transportation Act, I don't believe that you're going to actually see a meshing of the goals of the Clean Air Act and the ultimate transportation mobility of this country.
What would NRDC do if the provisions are not included in the reauthorizing legislation as their next step?
Well, I really hope we won't have to come to that, but quite frankly, the Air Act does mandate certain kinds of reductions of emissions. If there is not a method of incorporating planning that leads us to those emission reductions that is explicit about how we're going to get from here to there, I think that many courts would be sympathetic with an interpretation that would mean that, implicitly speaking, the local transportation boards and the local governments are responsible for achieving those goals, even though it's not being spelled out explicitly in the transportation law. So I think that's a roundabout way to get to the same place, but quite frankly, given that there is a mandate to achieve air quality over a certain period of time, and there are mandated reductions in the areas that are now in exceedance of either the carbon monoxide or the ozone level limits that have been set under the Clean Air Act, I think most courts would agree that transportation has to be aimed at and achieving the air quality goals.
Thank you. Mr. Rissy, can you speak to why you believe we must address planning regionally and explain what a region might be rather than under the authority of the states?
Well, part of my testimony, which I omitted in the interest of time, describes the Washington-Baltimore region in which we live, which is 8 million acres of land. That's about 1.6 times the size of New Jersey, and has about the same population, or has, yes, about the same population at the present time, 6.5 million, projected to grow to 8 million. If we grow to 8 million, and if we do not expand our region further than the current 8 million acres, we will have an average regional density of 1 person per acre. That is 1/10 the density necessary to support a threshold rational system of service provided by the public, transportation, mail delivery, school services. That 10 people per acre is the minimum sort of threshold. That means that in our urban region we need to have about 9 of every 10 acres in open space of one sort, farming, other kinds of open space activity, watershed protection. That also opens up the opportunity over the next 30 years to redevelop those areas which we have so badly developed in the last 40 years thanks to our current transportation policy. And we can do that by market forces. We don't need to do it by government subsidy. If we redevelop, for instance, Fairfax County, which we know to be 3% of the total area of the region and has about 13% of the region's population, but 3% of the region's area. If we were to redevelop that at a rational density, we could absorb all of the development projected for the northern part of Virginia for the next 25 years and still have 1/3 of the county vacant. We have done that badly with redevelopment. We have another example in the northern part of Virginia, the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, wherein we have redeveloped because we put in a transit system and we provided for a renewal of that area. We now have a mix of housing, we have jobs, we have shopping, and we have a much more compatible density and pattern vis-a-vis the transportation system. We have used our $10 billion investment in the metro system well in that area. We have used it abominably poorly in most of the region.
Thank you, Mr. Rissy, and thank you to members of this panel for the valuable contributions you've made to a critical topic. This concludes the 3 panels that the committee is hearing today, and with that, this hearing is adjourned.
That concludes this hearing on U.S. transportation policy. For more information, write to the House Interior and Insular Affairs Subcommittee at 1324 Longworth House Office Building here in Washington, D.C. The zip code is 20515. Coming up next, an American Profile interview with Texas Rangers manager George W. Bush. From Washington, this is C-SPAN 2, a cable satellite.